All right, hello. My name is Cole Wilson. I am a junior at Illinois State University. I'm majoring in ag business. I currently farm in Central Illinois. Our farms about 2,400 acres or so. And today I'm sitting here with Shelby Stoner. She's currently a grad student at ISU. Tell me a bit about yourself, Shelby.
Yeah, so I'm from Congerville, Illinois, which is pretty central, and I went to Eureka High School, and I did not grow up on a farm. I don't have a farming background, but Eureka is a pretty small farm town, and it was really there where I was really involved in our FFA, and I had a couple of teachers in high school that really pushed me to go into ag in college. And so that led me to ISU, and I got my undergrad degree in agronomy management here at ISU, and then I also stayed for 2 more years for my master's in agronomy as well. And I am working with anaerobic digestion of cover crops is my thesis project.
All right. Do you think that a big role in like getting into farming is just coming from a farm town?
So that's kind of what helped me get into ag and into farming. I do have a couple relatives that are farmers, but they're not super close. I didn't really have any experience like farming with them or anything when I was young. I mean, my mom's a nurse and my dad, he does like dirt work. And so just coming from there, I was just always interested in it. And yeah, coming from a farm town was definitely a big part of like me going into ag. But you don't have to have that either. Yeah. It's not required or anything.
I would say I see at ISU 90% of the students in the ag building come from a farm area. If not a farm background, they're connected someplace if it's their town or whatnot. And I would love to see more people from maybe like the Chicago area come for ag, because I think a change in perspective and to get the word about farming and different aspects of farming to those areas to inform those people could really benefit. Do you think there's like any way that like to get some of those areas more interested in agriculture?
So, just from personal experience, I've seen a lot of like animal science students there's where you get more of like the urban areas and more people from Chicago. They're more interested in like becoming a vet and interested in the animal sciences as opposed to like the farming community. And I think that really goes back to like they're not from like a farming area or their parents aren't farmers and that kind of thing, whereas like a lot of our agronomy students and ag business students, they do come from like a farm or agriculture background of some sort, and they're just here to get their degree, and then a lot of them go back to the farm and contribute there, or they find a job in the agriculture industry close.
Yeah, I think really it'd be great for more people to get into the ag industry because there's always going to be jobs.
Absolutely.
And like, let's say you want to be a salesperson, getting into something like ag sales can be, I think, a much easier market to get into versus like other big corporation sales. But people don't even look at it because they're scared about not knowing anything about ag. But I don't think that's something a lot more people should consider.
Yeah.
Well, you said your thesis was about anaerobic digestion of cover crops. Can you kind of tell me like what that is?
Yeah, so anaerobic digestion is basically a closed system, and the goal of that is to produce biogas, and that biogas is used for like a biofuel. So it's used in like heating areas and that kind of thing. But then we also are looking at what we're putting into the system. So that's where like the cover crops comes along. I've worked with soybean biomass, cereal rye, annual rye, and pea clover radish oat mix. And I'm also working with corn stover right now. So I've got 5 different biomass types, and basically we start with small reactors that have different ratios of the biomass to swine manure. That's what I'm using, as well as a digestion effluent from the wastewater treatment plant here in Normal. And we're putting all those into these small reactors to test what produces the most amount of biogas, but also what keeps the nutrients in the system. So we're trying to see what nutrients are going into the system. We're testing that. And then we're also, after the 40-day period of the digestion process, we're analyzing the nutrients afterwards. So we want to be able to basically field apply the effluent afterwards, the digestate that comes out of those systems, in order to like basically form a fertilizer that's not like synthetic. So it comes from the waste of the biomass from the cover crops that wouldn't really be used. It would just be cycled back into the soil, or some people use it for feed for their livestock. But if it's not being used for that, a lot of farmers just kill it off and use it for ground cover over the winters. And we're also using that swine manure that's also a waste product. So we're basically turning something that would not be used into something that's usable afterwards. So we're using those small reactors, and we're analyzing them for their ratios, and then we're taking the ratio that was most productive and putting that into a large scale experiment. So the large scale experiment is around 120 liters, and the small experiment around like 10 liters.
Yeah. So in terms of like regenerative ag, what could this lead to in maybe solving conventional ag problems or taking over certain conventional ag practices?
So these digesters, there are large scale digesters. There's around 300 in the US, and a lot of them are focused on using fruit and vegetable waste and dairy manure. And so this is just basically putting different inputs in to basically just like test the outputs in a way. So it's just using a waste product that wouldn't be used to like make the system full circle basically. Yeah. So we could use the manure from cattle, from hogs, and put it into this system while also using waste products from the field. Like after the corn and soybeans are harvested, we can use that biomass that's the combine shoots out and put it into this system where it would just, a lot of it blows away or goes back into the soil. But when you have so much of that in the soil, it doesn't get broken down at a certain point, but it can be helpful in that way in producing like heat and energy for the farm. It just makes it more of a closed system.
Do you think it could expand outside of the farm? Because I know biofuels are kind of starting to take spark and grow bigger and bigger, even with like corn and stuff like that. Like, do you think this can be spread to like different companies to use these biofuels instead of the farmer and sell it?
I mean, there's potential, definitely, but it takes a lot of manure and a lot of like biomass, a lot of waste. So I think in rural communities, not so much unless you are on that farm, but in like bigger cities where there's food waste all the time, or where there's like waste like that can be used, 100% it could be used large scale.
Yeah. Is there anything more that you are trying to add to your thesis, or do you think it's pretty much you have your outline and you're just trying to get down the like nitty gritty of it? You know what I'm saying?
So basically, like I've researched I have almost all my research complete. Right now, I'm working on my last biomass, which is corn stover that we harvested this fall. Right now, we have the small digesters going right now. We've got 12 of those. And then we're also working on our large-scale reactor as well. We just got that started 2 weeks ago, so that'll run for 40 days.
When you say we, how many of you guys are there?
So we, meaning like me and my professor.
Okay.
And then I have an undergrad student worker who works for me. And then there's another person who's working on her thesis as well. That's a graduate student under my professor. And so they help me a lot do all this stuff. And
yeah, that's nice. Just kind of sticking on the topic of regenerative ag. Just from what you've learned in a classroom, in like your studies, what do you think is kind of some of the biggest challenges with American farmers transitioning to regenerative ag?
So what I've noticed is a lot of regenerative ag farms are pretty small. And like the big ones, they focus a lot on biodiversity of crops, which is great, but they only have like 200 to 300 acres. And that's really big when you're talking about multi-crop, like vegetable production, fruit production, and things like that. But you also have to have the correct climate for that as well. So around here, I think it's doable. It's just maybe not on like 25 to 300 acres. Like that seems like insane. You'd have to have a lot of labor, a lot of people helping you, and the labor cost would be really, really high. Just because you're not using those chemicals, you're not using like things like that. It would have to be more like focusing on biodiversity, but not in the same growing season. Like having crop rotations in your fields of, say, like, okay, corn and soybeans are our crop rotation right now with some wheat, but also incorporating like a pumpkin and like maybe like a food grade corn and like different varieties of cover crops instead of just cereal rye. Okay, well that's a grass crop, adding in some type of legume like a pea clover radish oat mix. That's got 4 different varieties of crops in it, and they'd be able to just provide that biodiversity in there, and just that kind of thing. It would be a lot harder to do like a vegetable type of regenerative farm, and you also have to go out and find your own market for that. Like you basically have to do like some type of farm stand or farmers markets in the summer, but then a lot of farmers haul their grain in the winter and do stuff like that. There's still a market for them in the winter time, where if you don't have crops growing in the winter, there's a lot less of a market for that, and a lot less profit flow coming in.
Yeah. If one of those big farmers, say the farmers that were farming 25 to 3 to 4, 5,000 acres, ran an operation that was strictly conventional, they plant, they harvest, they go in, till every single square foot, put down anhydrous ammonia, put on God knows how many pounds of nitrogen and how many chemicals and stuff. And they came to you and they said, I can't make a 180 switch, but what are some of the first steps that I can take to start to put in some practices?
So I would say definitely reduce tillage. Maybe not no tillage at all, but moving to like a strip till.
I think strip tilling is great. I mean, you strip something like 80% less. You're only stripping like 15% of your actual field. Yeah. There's no need to disrupt that soil you're not using.
Yeah, exactly. And like minimal tillage, but also soil testing, making sure that what you're applying is what you actually need, but also focusing on the timing of that application as well. So if you're applying in the fall, most of that nitrogen, most of those chemicals are going to be lost come springtime when you plant. And I understand sometimes it's convenient to do it in the fall and you're not so focused on getting everything ready for planting and stuff like that. It's really busy in the spring, but maybe just taking some small steps like that. And then when you kind of get down the strip till and the soil testing and nutrient applications, like in the springtime or when the crops are actually in the field, moving into doing like cover crops, adding cover crops on some of your fields, testing out fields at a time, a certain amount of acres at a time, transitioning into more regenerative practices instead of everything at once, because that can seem super overwhelming. And sometimes, and then you give yourself some area to figure out like what works and what doesn't, and also give yourself some time and some practice with that as well.
Yeah, I would say definitely a big thing to note on is time. I think not many farmers understand switching over is not gonna be worth it in the first year or the second. I mean, a lot of things like cover crops and whatnot, or if you go to even to no-till, it's gonna take up to maybe 10 years before you start seeing the benefit. But in 20, 30 years, you're gonna thank the Lord that you did switch that time ago.
And just really focusing on like trusting the process instead of, oh, well, this didn't work the first year, so we're not going to do it the second year. It's just being patient and really considering like the time you're putting into this is important. And just really being patient and trusting the process instead of trying it one year and saying, oh, well, we took a yield hit, that just means it doesn't work. Well, really looking at the material we have as well, the research that's put out on these things, it's saying, like the research is saying that it's taking 5 years for these cover crops to start. The yield jumps back up around 5 years. Taking that yield hit in the first 5 is going to be tough, but finding ways like to like government programs, for example, in order to like substitute that loss that you're seeing.
Yeah, I think a lot more people should inform themselves on government programs. It's not very hard to get stuff like cover crops paid for. I also think there's certain regenerative ag practices that will get paid for too. Like we get paid on our farm, just an example is we get paid for our regenerative practices through carbon credits about $7 an acre, which really adds up. And when we started it, we had been doing it for about 7 years, and they paid us $7 an acre for every acre we did for those 7 years previously.
Yeah.
So there's some real good like credit programs you can do out there that can really make up for and even add money from the differences. I think many people don't want to go out and research, don't want to deal with the process of getting that government stuff. Like it can be a little bit of a process sometimes getting enrolled in those.
Yeah.
And I think maybe another issue is a lot of farmers nowadays, which is something I personally love to fight against. That might just be me and my stubbornness, but doing something just because your grandpa did it, just because your dad did it on the farm, that don't mean that you need to be doing it.
Yeah.
Every day when we do stuff, I try and challenge the thought of, is this necessary? And sometimes I ask all the time on the farm, why are we doing this? Like, not that I have an issue with doing it. Like, if you want me to go out and take soil samples or to do this or that, which is great, I ask why, so I at least know what we're doing. And sometimes if they say, well, this is what we've done, I say, well, maybe we need to rethink this. And there's plenty of stuff we do. And there's little things on the farm that we don't even get into the details, but Grandpa just says, well, this is just kind of what I've done, so that's how we're going to do it.
Yeah.
But
have you seen anything that you've challenged them about that they've actually considered and changed their mindset on, or how does that kind of go for you?
One thing I'm working on right now is challenging what cover crops we plant. I think we should get into different stuff maybe, or consider it or look into it. Maybe not just planting oats and radishes because it's easy that the winter kills them. I think there's stuff to explore there. A lot of the stuff that I go to challenge, my dad does a good job about already having looked into it. Like just the other day I had a conversation with him about looking at our yield maps and maybe getting into variable rates. We learned about that in class, stuff like, do we really need to put a consistent rate of nitrogen and fertilizer and chemicals on all of our land? I mean, some of the stuff probably doesn't necessarily need it, and some of the stuff it's probably not worth putting that much money in. And I talked to him about it, and he said he's considered it, but something is people around here don't really do that often, because in this area we have about the best farm ground in the nation, and it's so consistent, like consistently good, that variable rate really just isn't worth it. Like, it's more for farmers who have land that's just so terribly bad that you just don't need to put the money into some stuff, which is probably majority of ag ground in the U.S. I mean, we farm well, like watered, flat, like high organic matter, naturally dirt. And there's so many farmers that would give an arm and a leg to farm that. I mean, I have a buddy who just moved here to help farming from Iowa, and he's just in awe with our farm ground. The fact that we don't have any hills, the fact that there's not many trees, which trees can help in some circumstances, but he says it's just so much easier. It's easier, and we're yielding 20, 30 bushels for corn more and 15 more with beans maybe than they were. So yeah, and maybe some other stuff I've challenged is one part of our farm, right next to our farmstead, we have some runoff of chemicals and stuff from the farmstead and whatnot, and we never get anything to grow there. And I've always pushed maybe putting in a retention pond there, because I wouldn't mind having a little retention pond like right next to the farmstead. I mean, nothing's going to grow there. We get that farm ground and whatnot. And another thing is, whenever I push regenerative ag to my dad in certain practices, is in Illinois, 60% of the farmland farmed is rented. And who wants to put in the money for long-term views on something that you're not even promised to farm next year? You know, so I don't know what the solution would be to having more farmers own more land. Maybe it's just longer contracts. That's doing 1-2 years, maybe getting the 10-year contracts. But the landowners are going to have to understand that that will benefit them, because you're helping their ground out. Going year from year, no one's going to want to put in that work to their ground to have it yield more in 20, 30 years. Like, it really is going to be a good ROI maybe to find a farmer that you like, that is a good regenerative like mindset, and locking them in for certain years.
Yeah. A lot in our regenerative ag class, we talked about incorporation of animals into the farm.
Mm-hmm.
How realistic do you think that would be for, I mean, even you guys? Have you talked about that with your dad and stuff?
So we've talked about it, and the issue is that my father in general hates animals. He's not an animal guy, doesn't like dogs, cats, nothing like that. But I have always had a love for animals, and I think that's something that I want to incorporate. Like this past year, I started with just chickens, which I think anyone who lives in an area that can have chickens should have chickens. But I'm going to get maybe some goats and pigs within the next 1 or 2 years. And with that, I will probably start marking off, starting with like maybe just 2 or 3 acres right next to our farm that I'm going to use like more manure than other fertilizers and stuff like that to see what difference it makes before we really get into big farming. But as far as replacing for large farms all of your like fertilizer needs with animals, I personally don't think that it's necessarily possible, because with all that animals staying regenerative, you would need a lot of ground to graze. Like, in order to have enough animals to make a huge impact on cutting cost on fertilizer and stuff, I would need probably just the amount of land I have now just for animals to graze.
Yeah. So do you guys outsource a lot of your manure, or do you do synthetics for like phosphate, P and K?
Yeah, we use, it's on my phone exactly, we don't use any manure. We put down stuff, just when our strips we put down fertilizer, and in our buggy we put down fertilizer. We put down stuff like pelletized lime just to keep a consistent PK and stuff in the ground. And we use fertilizers like MAP and there's an MEP maybe also, something like that. I have a list on my phone, but yeah, we outsource all that, obviously, and we try not to put too much on. Like, I think per year we put on about per acre 200 pounds of nitrogen, which seems like a lot, but we get paid to use that amount, like to not use more than that. Like, compared to other farms, it's not that much. Another thing is we've completely transitioned out of anhydrous ammonia because, I mean, it's just terrible for your soil. I mean, it just kills all biolife, destroys organic matter. It just is not good. I don't understand why people still use that so much, but I think it comes down to that's what you've been doing for years and whatnot. And I think a big thing is, like, we make large efforts to inform ourselves about what we can change. All year long, we go to farm meetings for different companies and see what they have to say. And we meet with an agronomist maybe once a month or so. In the summer, probably more than that. And he gives us opinions on stuff, and because he works with a lot more experimental acres than we do. So, and a lot of that stuff we are open to changing. Like, for example, we used this thing called Sugar Mover for the first time 2 years ago that we just put in with our stuff that is supposed to just help with like a more natural nutrients. Not that it necessarily replaced a whole bunch, but we just kind of put it in. One of the reasons we used it was that was the year that we had a drought and it was smoke in the air. So our crops just didn't have the ability to get the nutrients that they needed that they would naturally get. So this is something we started that year, and we use a little bit but less this year. But knowing something like that, like for years where you might be lacking the nutrients to use, and I mean, it's food grade stuff. I mean, the guy said, if you have sweet corn, I'd recommend spraying it on it because it's called Sugar Mover because it does have sugar in it. He says it makes your sweet corn sugar and it's good for it and stuff. So I think using stuff like that is good. And on that topic of like new things is, I think ag companies are almost just as big of a part of making a change as the farmers.
Yeah.
Like, they're the ones making these chemicals that are making stuff better for you and stuff. Like, I'm not going to be able to invent something. Like, I just don't have the facilities, the time or the effort. Like, I think it's up to the farmer to use new practices, but I think it's up to the companies to develop new stuff. And I think it's up to the government to allow companies to be able to do this research and stuff like that. And one thing I will say is I think stuff like precision ag is maybe the biggest change in our future. Like I talk about this quite a bit when it comes to this, but like something like See and Spray technology where you spray 75% less chemicals.
Yeah.
If the country sprayed 75% less chemicals, I mean, that'd be a huge
that's huge.
And it's expensive now, but 10, 15 years, it's going to be a heck of a lot more affordable.
Yeah.
So I do think a lot of companies are working towards making a bigger difference.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you see that can kind of help with like a middle ground with farmers, or maybe something you hope becomes more popular in like farming?
Well, kind of like you were saying, you guys kind of you guys have limited your anhydrous use, and you guys are taking advantage of these carbon credits programs and these cover crop programs that are offered. And honestly, there is a potential for farmers to like use those programs more, and it's almost just like farmers educating themselves. Like the more they know about these programs and the more that they know just in general about what's going on their farm and what's like new and upcoming, or like you said, just not doing things just because their grandpa did it or their dad did it, just doing it because. Mm-hmm. And I feel like it'd be really helpful just for more people to just challenge their thoughts and their processes, and just before things are forced. Like we want to avoid regulations and stuff like that at all costs, but if farmers aren't willing to change their ways and change their practices, then there's no other options. Like regulations are coming. Yeah. And so obviously you don't want that, but it's avoidable, and really taking advantage of these programs and things like that, it just helps mitigate the yield loss and your loss on income.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the thing that's going to maybe make a difference is, I know it's been years and years and years that people have been talking about cutting down chemicals and stuff. Like we talked about the book Silent Spring, and that was an old book that talked about it. But I think now we're really starting to see some of the effects of it. I mean, you get to coastal cities and seeing how much stuff like nitrogen is going into the water. There's communities along can't remember the name of the place, but there's a community along the coast that they're basically their whole like thing is oysters, and you just can't take oysters from there. They don't produce as much. The ones that you are able to produce aren't healthy enough. So we're starting to see people that are really getting affected by it. And I think every single person is getting affected by it more than they would think. Like studies show, like there's a high percentage of people that have Roundup in their blood system, and I think that causes issues that we just don't for sure know yet. I mean, how big of a spike have we seen in autism in the last 30 years? Like, couldn't that come from the food that we're eating and stuff like that? And like maybe even mental illnesses. Like I think some of that, some of it is other stuff, but like changing the way our brains are working, I think some of those chemicals just can't be doing that. And for me as a farmer, I should probably care about it more, because when I think about the food that I'm eating. I mean, I basically eat Roundup for breakfast when we're spraying it. I get facefuls of Roundup every day. I mean, stuff like that and chemicals, like I should probably be more worried about, but yeah.
Yeah, it's just so interesting to think about sometimes, because these chemicals and stuff, I mean, relatively speaking, they aren't that old. Like, there hasn't been all this time to research the effects that these have on animals and humans, and the more that we're researching, the more that we're finding out that there's negative impacts. And so, I mean, you can't always say, oh, Roundup is the cause of all these things going on in humans, because there's a lot of factors that go into that. But I mean, I think you're right to like correlate. There's a possible correlation, maybe, but it's just like there's still
Something to
so
look
much
into.
research. Exactly.
Yeah.
Something to look into, because these are major life changes that we've had to like the food system and just how things are produced. Just, I mean, in the last 50 some years. So it's just really interesting and something to think about. But
another question I kind of had for you was, you spend all this time learning about ag. Most of your ag knowledge comes from a classroom, I'm assuming.
mm-hmm.
Is there anything that you kind of learn in the classroom and you see like this is just a no-brainer, or some stuff that you just really think that you're missing a perspective from a farmer, like in what their thought process are? Like, do you think about it that much? Like,
Yeah. So everything I am taught is coming from the classroom, and it's coming from somebody else's experience instead of firsthand experience. So I came into school not knowing hardly anything about like the ag industry and how like crops are grown and all these practices and stuff like that. And so to learn about them with no like farming point of view was really interesting to me. It seemed because when we're using cover crops and looking at the studies that are shown and stuff, it seems like such a no-brainer to me. Like, why aren't farmers using these? Like, it's a no-brainer. Like, why would you not want to help improve your soil and like get this yield jump? Yeah, it might take a couple years, but in the end, it's beneficial. And just to learn that, like, obviously everything that happens in the classroom can't happen in the field,
mm-hmm.
but just thinking about things like that are practical and that seem so practical to me and seem like no-brainers, that's just not how it happens in the industry. And yeah, I have a job coming up in May, and I'm really interested to know and to learn about what actually happens in the industry compared to what I have learned in the classroom, and trying to help farmers also understand like where I'm coming from the classroom, but also understanding their perspective as well about why they do the things that they do nowadays.
And I come from a complete opposite perspective. Like, I know freshman year coming in, taking agronomy with Dr. Heller, I thought it was all complete bullcrap, and I thought that they just had no heart for a farmer, because I came from a background where we spray these chemicals because we get yield, because we make money, and like that's our livelihood.
Yeah.
And in my mind, we had to spray those chemicals, and we had to get as big a yield as possible to make the most money.
Yeah.
Yield was money, and that's all I cared about. So going in, I remember Dr. Heller, when he would first say stuff like, "Oh, we don't need to be spraying this, or don't we need doing that," I'd be like, "Dude, you're just a professor. You don't understand. Like, this is not realistic whatsoever." But I've completely opened my eyes to it, and I think Dr. Heller has done a great job of getting the point across. I think this class that me and you are taking right now, like a regenerative ag class, I've learned so much in like how yield doesn't mean money. Maybe less inputs means money, and maybe more yield and more money now is going to mean less money in the future, and that I should care more about 20 years from now than I do right now.
Yeah. And I think the industry really puts a huge emphasis on yield and making money. Like, obviously, it's your livelihood. You have to make money somehow, but the emphasis, I feel like, in school is more of, okay, well, what is your soil health and quality like, and what is your ecosystems like? It puts a lot of emphasis on the soil and how, and like conserving the soil and improving it and that kind of thing. Like, soil quality, like good soil quality equals money and not yield equals money. Like farmers come at it with more of a business mindset, in my opinion, than like an ecological benefit. And so that's just been something really interesting and like a huge learning curve for me over the past couple of years, because like that is a farming livelihood and a lot of farmers struggle to break even. And so if you take a small yield hit, like with adding cover crops for 5 years, it can be really, really tough. I mean, that can be a make or break right there.
Yeah.
And so it's just putting your feet in different shoes. Like it's just so different to think of it from a different point of view.
Yeah. And I think another thing is learning what a healthy environment really is, because I think in my mind and a lot of farmers' minds, they think, I'm going to till all this ground because it'll be easier to put the seed in the ground. It'll be easier for it to come up, and spraying all these chemicals on it will make it yield more. If it's yielding more, it has to be a healthier plant.
Yeah.
So if it's yielding more, that means the ground has to be healthier.
Yeah.
And I just think not many people realize that that's just not the case.
Yeah.
Do you have any more to say?
No, this has been a great conversation.
Yeah. All right.